My name is Carmen Vendlin. I'm Curator of Art here at the New Mexico Museum of Art. And I'd like to welcome you to St. Francis Auditorium. And we're very happy to be partnering with Las Golondrinas for this series of 3 speakers. I hope many of you came to the first one, and of course you're here tonight, and I hope you'll come to the third as well. And I wanted to embarrass our events manager by saying this has been her dream to have someone speak about St. Francis in St. Francis Auditorium. So I hope that you will enjoy this as much as we enjoy hosting this event. So I'm going to turn things over to Joe Mays from Las Golondrinas now. So welcome and thank you for coming to this event.
Welcome to the Speaking of Traditions lecture series, brought to you by El Rancho de las Golondrinas. Now that was fun. Thank you, Carmen. Like Carmen said, my name is Joe Mays with El Rancho de las Golondrinas. I would like to thank our amazing host, the New Mexico Museum of Art, the gracious Director Mary Kershaw, Events Manager Martha Landry, and all Museum of Art staff. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we are in for a special treat. Our presenter tonight is Reverend Monsignor Jerome Martinez. On a personal note, he has been a hero of mine and an inspiration of mine for my entire life. Once upon a time, while attending St. Mike's, Brother Wayne asked me to consider becoming a Christian brother. I declined, and thought perhaps it would be better to be a diocesan priest, like Monsignor Jerome. The next day, my chess club teammate, Adam Ortega, informed me that he would enter the seminary. And for a moment, I almost said, me too. New Mexico is blessed with Monsignor Jerome Martinez. He orchestrated the building of Santa Maria de la Paz, the reconstruction and restoration of our beautiful St. Francis Basilica. Among his many degrees and honors, he was knighted to the Equestrian Order of the Holy Sepulchre. He was named Prelate of Honor and given the title of Monsignor by Pope John Paul II. He presently serves as Rector at Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe in Milwaukee. Ladies and gentlemen, we are delighted, proud, and honored to present Reverend Monsignor Jerome J. Martinez y Alire. I ask that you reserve all questions until the end of the presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Monsignor.
Good evening. Oh, that was pathetic. Good evening. Okay, now I know you're alive. It's a pleasure to be here at St. Francis Auditorium to talk about St. Francis, and I find it kind of ironic that I'm not a Franciscan myself, because my family comes from Cebolla. Anybody know where Cebolla is? It's a suburb of Canjilon. It's near Rio Arribas, it's county capital, which is Tierra Maria. And that mission was taken care of by the Franciscans for as many years as I remember, going there to Mass with my grandparents. In fact, I'll never forget that they rang the bell for Mass a half hour beforehand to let the people know that the Franciscan priest had arrived from his circuit riding. At 15 till they would start ringing the bell again to let everybody know the Franciscan was hearing confessions. at 5 till the bell was rung again right before Mass, just to let all the men who were smoking outside to come in for the Mass. So I have very vivid recollections of the Franciscans in my life. And I was very much impressed by the Franciscans of great holiness that we had at the cathedral. I think of Father Austin, who was a great Franciscan, a great mentor to me. But I didn't become a Franciscan. I became a diocesan priest, as was mentioned to you. We're the men in black. The Franciscans are the brown baggers. They wear the brown habit. We are members of the diocesan priesthood of the Archdiocese of Santa Fe. And I must say that I was influenced to be that by my pastor, Monsignor Philip Cassidy at St. Anne's in Santa Fe, who was a great inspiration. Just wanted to say that I've been here as a family member for 13 generations. My family goes back that far. My father has a cute way of saying it. We never crossed the border crossed us. In fact, several times. And we never moved in the process. One of my professors of history was Dr. Myra Ellen Jenkins. I'm not sure if any of you remember her. She was a devout member of Holy Faith Episcopal Church, and she was the state historian for many years. So she gave me the history of Christianity in New Mexico in a simple phrase. Catholicism came to New Mexico on the sandal-shod feet of Franciscans. Baptists came on horseback. Methodists and Presbyterians waited for the buggies. And the Episcopalians waited for the Pullman cars. She said it, she's an Episcopalian, so I disagree. But certainly the first part is true, that first Christianity came on the sandal-shod feet of Franciscans. Now I'm going to say that most New Mexicans are Franciscans at heart, because our culture here in this state has been changed so much and formed so much by the example of that simple man that we can call ourselves Franciscans in spirit. Now, what happened to Christianity before Francis came? Basically, the early Christianity before 312 AD was a persecuted sect that the Roman Empire tried to destroy because they felt they were unpatriotic for not worshiping the divine Augustus. And the Christians said, no, we cannot pay worship to idols. And of course, they were persecuted, and mostly by some emperors like Diocletian, almost to the point of extinction. But in 312, the miraculous occurred. The Emperor Constantine became Christian, and therefore, by the year 315, not only allowed Christianity to be worshipped publicly, but also became the official religion of the empire. What happened then is almost all of a sudden there was a dilution of fervor to Christianity. Millions became Christians that had been something else, some pagan religion. And so Christianity became diluted in its term of fervor and faith and devotion. As a consequence, there was a movement among Christians, mostly in the 5th and 6th centuries, to withdraw from the world. This was the birth of the monastic movement, most of all spearheaded by Benedict of Nursia, who was the father of Western monasticism. And their answer to Christianity being diluted in a mass society under the Roman Empire was to withdraw from the world, to live in monasteries, to not be polluted by Christians that were basically just cultural Christians. So the monastic movement was really quite powerful in Europe and preserved learning and the liturgy and many other aspects of civilization lost when the fall of the Roman Empire occurred. Now, urban society came to be in the fore about 1100, 1200, and that's an area where society had taken religion and used it as rote. It was basically now just a cultic religion and no longer fervent religion. Now, Francis' genius in all this was in modeling a Christianity that was appealing for its simplicity. You didn't have to be a martyr to become a saint, but you could attain sanctity by dying to self through poverty, obedience, and chastity. You didn't have to go to the Crusades to become a knight for Our Lady, because you could be chivalrous to the poor, the dispossessed. You could live Jesus' life without monasteries and many rules, in utter simplicity. I think most of you know his conversion story. He was a very wealthy son of a fabric merchant in Assisi. And he basically was a playboy and known for his loose life and loose women. And he finally decided that he would do something serious, and he decided with his friends to volunteer for the war against the neighboring city-state called Perugia. Well, in the process of fighting the battle, he was captured and kept in captivity for over a year. During this time, he had somewhat of a nervous breakdown. He came back to Assisi a changed man, and many people thought he had gone just a little off the edge. It was during that time that he came across the ruined church called San Damiano, and there was a crucifix in it, the one like you'll see in the cathedral or any church dedicated to Francis, that spoke to him in prayer and said, "Francis, rebuild my church, for it has fallen into ruin." He took it personally or literally, and so he started rebuilding the church there with stone and masonry. And he began to realize perhaps that wasn't exactly what the Lord meant. It was to renew the church spiritually. He had a tremendous conversion experience once when meeting a leper whom he regarded with horror before, but now he regarded as seeing the face of Christ. And so he had his conversion experience then. He started to sell his father's goods, much to his father's chagrin, who was a wealthy businessman. And he started selling his goods, most especially the fabrics, the silks, and using it to feed the poor. With that, the father was infuriated, and he had him in prison for a while in the private chapel of the Bernardonians. Finally, he escaped and did it again, and this time the father took him to the bishop of Assisi, Bishop Gubbio, and said, "Please judge, because this man has violated the fourth commandment of not honoring his father and mother, and I want you to convict him of this." The bishop didn't have anything to say at the moment, but Francis did, and he took off all his clothes and said, "What you have given to me, I give back to you. My Father in heaven is now my only Father." So he stood naked there before the bishop, covered him in his coat, and it was from there that he began to start his order of penitence. That was the way the Franciscans were called, penitents, the order of penitence. And they lived in utter simplicity as mendicants. This was a totally new religious order in the Catholic Church, not living in monasteries and secluded from the world, but being in the world, among the poor, and living the counsels of the Beatitudes literally. So they would go, for example, from town to town begging and helping with the workers in the fields, and living only by God's generosity and providence. There is one wonderful story that Francis and his brothers were chosen to go beg for the rest who were working, and so they went from house to house in Assisi, and they had the door slammed on them, or they were spit upon. And at the end of the day, Francis gathered his brothers together and said, "Let us give thanks at the mealtime," and they had nothing to eat. So one of the brothers said, "What are we giving thanks for?" Because this is what God wanted of us. This is what God wants for us today. So we're grateful. So it's that kind of utter simplicity that's so attractive about Francis that he took on many, many followers. By the time he died, there was over 5,000 Franciscans that joined him. And unfortunately, by the time he died, he kind of had come to disown the Franciscans because they had become so institutionalized. They had become part of the institutional church and were no longer living the stark simplicity and total dependence on providence that he had taught. In fact, when he came back from retreat on the mountaintop, he came back and they were building a mother house, and he tried to tear it down. He said this was a compromise with the world, to go back to a human institution that was so reliant on rules and regulations. Nonetheless, Innocent III approved the order, and they were called the Orders of Friars Minor, or the Order of Little Brothers. And Pope Innocent III had a dream. It was really quite a powerful dream because he was a great reformer in his own way, and he wanted to reform the church. And he had a terrible nightmare that the church, the Cathedral of St. John Lateran, the facade, which is the Cathedral of Rome, was collapsing. And he saw a man dressed in gray homespun holding up the Cathedral of St. John Lateran and picking it up and preventing it from falling. It was the next day that he met Francis of Assisi. He was the fulfillment of the dream. At first he thought he was one of the beggars at St. Peter's, and he said, "The soup kitchen's over there." But later on, when Francis had an audience, he realized who he was. And it was at that point that the Innocent approved the order. Well, they grew very, very rapidly. Unfortunately, it broke into different movements after Francis died. There were the observants, they were very strict in their observance. There were the Capuchins, there was the Order of Friars Minor, there were conventuals, and they all claimed Francis as their founder. Believe it or not, one of the areas where Francis was most effective in recruiting was Spain. And he visited Madrid, and there was a church there called San Francisco el Grande. You know what that means? Not St. Francis the Large, because he wasn't large. It means St. Francis the Great. And there's a church where he established his monastery there. In fact, thousands of Spaniards became Franciscans. And this all coincided very nicely, tucked into history, that by 1492, Spain had united itself under one religion and one monarchy. And this was the result of 700 years of La Reconquista, reconquering Spain from the Muslims, who had taken it in 711. And it took 700 years for the Spanish to take it back, kingdom by kingdom, duchy by duchy, to expel finally the Muslims in 1492, when Ferdinand de Isabella laid siege to Granada, the last stronghold of the Muslims in Spain. And it fell to them without battle, because the Islamic leader gave it up for reasons of not having any more bloodshed. As he left Granada, there's a mountain outside of Granada that's called El Monte de los Suspiros, where he sighed over the fall of Granada. He began to cry, and his mother was a tough cookie. She said, "Do not cry as a woman for what you have lost as a man." Ooh. That was a tough woman, wasn't it? Anyway, by 1492, the Spanish now were united under one monarchy and one religion, and they felt they had been released from the snares of Islam and had been given a nation state, and now they started to look outward. It so happened that in 1492, something else happened. Anybody remember? Okay, well at that point, the Spanish felt they had a God-given mission to spread their faith and their way of life to wherever they met, including the New World. Does that sound familiar? Does it sound like manifest destiny a few centuries later? America felt at one time in the 1800s that it had an obligation to spread its way of life, its government, and its Protestant ethic from sea to shining sea. The reason we're not part of the Empire of Spain or the Republic of Mexico now is because of that manifest destiny. Well, if you can understand that, you can understand that the Spanish felt they had this God-given mission, and when they found people in the New World, they were confounded by what to do with them. And they had great debates at the universities like Salamanca to decide whether they were human or not. Now that sounds very quaint, doesn't it? But wouldn't we have had the same questions had in 1969 we discovered little green people on the moon? Wouldn't we have had the same questions, perhaps not framed the same way? Are they human? Do they deserve protection under law? Are they subhuman? Are they worthy of missionization and salvation? Well, to their everlasting credit, the Spanish came up with a decision that yes, they're human. And they have rights under law. And they have rights under law, but they're to be treated like children. And the Spanish are the guardians. Isn't that convenient? But at least they were not treated as inhuman as some other European nations did to the American Indians. They treated them as human and worthy of missionization, which leads us to the Franciscans of New Mexico. Now, when Mexico City fell to Cortes in 1521, the King of Spain decided to missionize the New World by sending 12 Franciscans to Mexico. Get the symbolism? 12 Franciscans to Mexico. Their efforts at proselytizing or evangelizing was met with very little or limited success. That's because the Indians had remembered that although the Spanish regarded them as human beings, that oftentimes they were regarded more like slaves than children. And so the bad treatment of the Spanish soldiers gave the Indians a bad taste in their mouth for this new Christianity. They also felt that the Jesus that they were portraying and the Blessed Mother they were portraying was entirely too white or European. They could not understand that kind of religion that was not for them. It was not culturally or racially for them. Then something happened to change all of that, and that was the appearance of Our Lady of Guadalupe in 1531 on a mount outside of Mexico City called Tepeyac, which had been the home for the cult of the Earth Mother. And there our Blessed Mother appeared in ways in which the Indians could understand, but the Spanish could only be bewildered at. She appeared as an Indian to an Indian. She was dark. In fact, even to this day, the Mexicans call her La Morena. And she appeared not to the governor or to the viceroy or to the general or to the Archbishop of Mexico City. She appeared to a mere Indian convert, Juan Diego. And she said that she had heard the crying of her people and that she wanted the bishop to build her a home on that spot where she could take care of the wounded, the dispossessed, the marginalized. She said, "Do you not know that you are in the crossing of my arms?" Isn't that a beautiful phrase? Did you not know that you are in the crossing of my arms? Of course, the miracle of Our Lady of Guadalupe is that her image was somehow photocopied almost on this tilma of cactus fiber, and it was presented to the bishop, who regarded it rightfully as a miracle. To this day, Kodak and Los Alamos National Laboratories did some studies on the tilma, and they could find no pigment on it. It was like a giant Xerox. Some tremendous light created this image. And the fiber should have rotted a long time ago because cactus fiber is very delicate, but it's still strong today. In any case, the Indians could understand that she was for them, and this new religion was for them as well. And so there was mass conversions. Millions of Indians became Christian Catholics, and the Franciscans were at the vanguard of this. Now, how did they come to New Mexico? Well, in 1527, oops, I have a pointer somewhere. There was a man by the name of Cabeza de Vaca, who was part of an expedition near here, Galveston, Texas, right over here. And they were shipwrecked. And they tried to get rescued from that, but didn't find any help. And they went on a raft, a few of them, and some of them survived, including a Moorish slave by the name of Estebanico. Now, Cabeza de Vaca is said to have wandered all through Texas and apparently through the lower part of New Mexico and ended up here at Culiacan. It took only 8 years. And he supported himself by being a medicine man because he was an infirmarian on the ship. And so he was able to survive. And he was able to relate to the Viceroy of Mexico City that he had heard of the 7 cities of gold up here in north New Mexico. And of course, the Spanish were willing to believe anything. This is 1527 to 1535. What had happened? They had found Mexico City and the Aztecs incredible wealth and power. They had also found the Incans. So they were entirely ready to believe that there would be yet another wonderful treasure city. And so they wanted to explore and find out whether this was true or not. But the Viceroy, being a little cheap, decided not to send a major expedition without exploring a little bit further. And so he sent up from Mexico up the west coast. He sent up Fray Marcos de Niza, a Franciscan, with the same Moorish slave, Estebanico, that Cabeza de Vaca had traveled with. Now, I like to call Marcos de Niza the mendacious mendicant, because he was quite a piece of work. He was traveling up here, and he was not in as good a shape as Estebanico, who had been walking for 8 years. So he had sent him ahead, and he told him to send back a cross every day to let him know whether there was any significant discovery that they had had. So Estebanico started to roam much further ahead. And when they crossed into New Mexico near the Pueblo of Jaicu, near Zuni, Estebanico sent back a life-size cross, saying that he had found something tremendous. By the time Estebanico got there, he was already killed by the time Fray Marcos de Niza, apparently either because he was black or because he was misusing the women. There are different accounts. In any case, Fray Marcos de Niza did not go into Hauiku, but he saw it from a distance. Have you ever seen mud-washed walls at a distance with a straw glistening? From a distance, it looked like a city of gold. And as he began to hightail it back, pick up his habit and start hightailing it back, the story got better and better the closer he got to Mexico City. The city was made of gold, the streets were paved with gold, the people ate gold. It was really a fantastical tale, but the Viceroy Mendoza said, very interesting. So he decided to send up an expedition in 1539, the famous expedition of Coronado. And this time they did follow the same path. That's why they didn't go up the Camino Real, but they came through this side. And when they got to Hauiku, they realized it was not a city of gold. At that point, the Spanish soldiers were about ready to strangle the friar. Because everything he had said was not true. So Coronado sent him back quietly at night so as not to be lynched by the soldiers. As we know, Coronado was accompanied by some friars, and his mission was not to evangelize the Indians. Coronado was really the only conquistador in the classical sense that came up to New Mexico. They were looking for treasure and gold and wealth and Indian peoples to subjugate. And the reign or the stay of Coronado was rather a brutal one, but he did explore as far as the Grand Canyon and as far as Kansas, looking for the cities of gold, which he never found. He was a broken man, literally, when he went back to Mexico. And he said, "This miserable kingdom is not worth the effort, Your Majesty." He's talking about our New Mexico. This miserable kingdom is not worth the effort, save for the fact that there are probably 30,000 Indian souls waiting for Christianity to be baptized. Now this perked in the mind of many Franciscans, and in 1583, several Franciscans moved up with the illegal Espejo expedition into New Mexico. They were not authorized by the Viceroy and they were arrested. But some of the Franciscans stayed behind to meet a martyr to death. Juan de Padilla is one of the examples that he died probably in Kansas and was brought back and is buried in Socorro. No, Isleta. Do you know the story of it? He was buried in a cottonwood casket. You know, Isleta is an ancient pueblo. And it's called Isleta. Why?
It's on an island.
It's a little island in the Rio Grande, that's right. And so what happened is the Franciscan would disconcertingly come up through the floor when the water levels would get up, and he would pop through the floor on the altar. A bit disconcerting if you're saying Mass, isn't it? And they opened the casket, and he was found incorrupt, with his blue cassock or friar's robe still intact. Anyway, in the 1970s, the pastor that was there, a good, efficient German, decided that he'd had enough of the friar popping up. So he covered him with concrete. And I guess he hasn't popped through anyway. In any case, the Franciscan history is always very interesting. Now what happened is by 1598, because of the experience of Franciscans being sent singly into New Mexico to missionize the Indians and being killed, the king decided that he would send this time an expedition of soldiers to protect the priests. So in 1598, Don Juan de Oñate was given the license to come up to New Mexico, and he was given a squadron of soldiers and their families. So specifically, one can actually say that New Mexico was founded as a missionary effort. And because they had already found out that there was neither glory or gold, but there was God to be worked for. So remember the three things the Spanish came for the Southwest: glory, gold, and God. They never found glory or gold, but they stayed for God. And so Oñate came up and he established headquarters here at Okeawinge, And from there he sent the 8 missionaries, the 8 Franciscans, to diverse sections of New Mexico. And they had more or less some kind of success, but not always. The myth that the Franciscans or the Spanish forced the Indians to become Christian is untrue. They just never had enough soldiers. I mean, they had 120 soldiers at the Presidio in Okawinge or in Santa Fe later, but that's not enough to control this area here. So the only reason that the Spanish soldiers would ever take any action is if the Indian Pueblo itself harmed the friar that was sent them. And you can always tell how successful the friars were by the size of the mission churches they built. For example, if the population was like at Pecos, around 2,000 people, 2,000 native Pueblo Indians at Pecos, they built a church that would house that many for Mass. And the church that they built at Pecos is the largest that was ever built in adobe, 6 bell towers at adobe. And it held about 400 to 500 people. So about that many of the 2,000 in the village had converted to Catholicism. You understand what I'm saying? So they were never forced to become Christian because the Spanish soldiers were just not that present to be able to do so. In any case, the early Franciscans had a very Eurocentric view of the Indians. They felt that to missionize them, to make them Catholic Christians, they had to make them European first. Does that sound familiar? That we have to make them Europeans first before they could become Catholic. And so oftentimes they tried to suppress their language, tried to suppress their customs and their way of life, suppress their feasts, and most especially the Franciscans saw the Pueblo Kachina religion as idolatry. And so they tried to suppress it. They even had very derogatory terms for their priests and for the kivas, which they called estufas, or ovens. And so they tried to suppress the Christianity. This caused tremendous tension in the pueblos itself between those who had become Christian and those who remained not Christian. This created a lot of tension. In some places, the tension was intolerable and there would be actual violence that would occur. Many of the Franciscans were very, very holy, good, willing and good intended men. You can't have come from Spain all the way out here to which must have been for them the moonscape, without having some goodwill. But also there was a great sense of misunderstanding of the native peoples and desensitization to their culture and their language and way of life. So what happened is that oftentimes they were not very successful and many of them went back to Mexico. This was only saved by a fellow by the name of Alonso de Benavides, who was the Franciscan general that came to do the inspection of the missions of New Mexico. And he brought with him many more recruits from the Franciscans in Mexico. And he was able to strengthen the missions. Now, what do we mean by strengthen the missions? He was able to make sure that they were staffed, which they had not been before. And he was also able to secure great supplies from the Spanish Empire. You must remember that there was no separation of church and state with the Franciscans and the Spanish Empire. The Spanish crown supported the church and vice versa. This was called the Patronato Real. And so everything that was supplied for the missions in New Mexico came from the crown. Not just even the nails, the hammers, the tools, their underwear, their food, chocolates, cigars, everything was brought up by the mission train to supply the missions of New Mexico. So this was established as a firm foundation to supply the missions of New Mexico with personnel and with material to continue their work. Alonso de Benavides was able to convince the viceroy that the mission was worth saving, that the province was worth saving, because they were seriously considering withdrawing from New Mexico. And so he exaggerated. I hate to say these Franciscans exaggerate a little bit. He said there was 5,000 or 6,000 being baptized each year, which was not true. Maybe in his dreams. But that's what he reported to the viceroy so as to keep on sending more money and more friars to this mission endeavor here in New Mexico. What happened though is you ended up, here's Albuquerque. It wasn't established by then. Here's Santa Fe became the secular capital of New Mexico, and Santo Domingo you know where Santo Domingo is, became the spiritual capital where the Franciscans were. Did this cause tension? Oh my gosh. First of all, they're Spaniards. They love to argue. And so they were very conscious of their rights and privileges as secular governor and as religious leaders. And so they were often fighting over what? The use of the Indians. Most of the governors of New Mexico were despicable people. They bought their license to become governors, and they expected to make money up by getting taxes and service from the Indians in the encomienda system. And so as a consequence, they were here to get as much money as possible to make it back home, at least to pay off for their debt, and then to make it back home in Spain as an hidalgo, or back in Mexico City. And so they oftentimes used the native population, but they were also very abusive of the Hispanic population that was here too. I don't know which group was treated worse, the Indians by Oñate or the Hispanics by Oñate. He cut off the legs, apparently, of the Acoma Indians who rebelled, but he also cut the heads off of the Spanish colonists who dared to buck him in any way. So on the whole, these governors were awful, and some of the Franciscan generals that were sent were also just as determined to use the Indians for their missionary efforts, to create the missions, to harvest the crops, to be able to support the efforts of the Franciscans. And so what ended up happening was a terrible encounter of the worst kind between the religious authorities based in Santo Domingo and the secular authorities based here in New Mexico. And what the Spanish Franciscans used was the threat of excommunication to the governors or of the Inquisition, of which they were in charge in New Mexico. That's pretty formidable tools, huh? The Spanish governor had the power of arrest. And so oftentimes the Franciscans, said generals, were arrested and in jail here in Santa Fe, while the governors were not allowed to go into church because they were excommunicated. And their governor's chair in the parroquia was thrown out on the street. This came to a head in 1680, where the Indians, being confused by the constant conflict between the Spanish Franciscans and governors, began to wonder aloud, do we really want these turkeys here? And now they could actually communicate with each other because they knew Spanish. So I found it ironic, that they were able to use the language of the oppressors to kick them out. So what happened is there were several droughts by 1579, and they were beginning to lose their converts who began to think that this conversion to Christianity was causing a downfall in their agricultural system. Of course, New Mexico is used to droughts, as we're experiencing now, but they were able to blame it on the Spanish and on the Franciscans. The Indians rose up in revolt in 1680, starting from the north and going down to the south, and approximately 300 to 400 Spanish citizens were killed and 21 Franciscans. It was a sobering experience. The remnant of the Spanish colonists met up in Socorro under Governor Otermin and went down to El Paso, where there was a mission already established. And there they stayed for 12 years. Otermin made an effort to re-establish the kingdom in 1681, but met with little success. Interestingly enough, some pueblos like Socorro and Isleta went back to El Paso to be with the Spanish because they remained faithful Catholics. So it's not entirely a black and white situation. You know what I'm saying? There were many among the Indians that were converted that remained faithfully Christian, although clandestinely so, during the 12-year interregnum of the Indian revolt. Now, I'd like to point out that this is one of the few areas in American history where the Indians won a war, not just a battle. The Indians won many battles against the American army, for example. They just never won the war. By attrition, they were brought down. But here, they actually drove the Europeans out. And they ended up being on the banks of the Rio Grande for 12 years. And up here in New Mexico, the Indians were also faring not so well. Under the native leader, Pope, he began to impose all kinds of authoritarian rule, and he sought to replace the Spanish with their own type of cruelty. He was deposed, and later on, they began to squabble among themselves and they began to be attacked by the Navajos and Apaches. So they began to wonder whether or not it was good to have had the Spanish in the first place, at least for protection against the nomadic Indians. What happened to the Spaniards? They kind of floundered there for 12 years. They established several communities up and down the Rio Grande until finally, in 1692, the King of Spain appointed a nobleman from Madrid to be the governor, Don Diego de Vargas Ponce de León, el Marquis de la Nava de las Barcinas, to his friends Don. And he was given the permission to reestablish the settlement, but not to make it una carnicería. Does anybody know what that means in Spanish? A butchery. He did not want a butchery. And at first, de Vargas was able to be successful in 1692. By 1693, he was less successful. But by then, by 1696, there was finally peace on the frontier of New Mexico. And the Franciscans came back, as did the Spanish, and everybody was changed. The Pueblos had realized that perhaps some of the things the Spanish brought were not that bad. Like the agricultural products, the livestock, the architecture, the carpentry, the material goods. Even Catholicism was not that bad. They began to realize that they needed the Spanish colonists to be able to survive against the common foe, which were the nomadic Indians. So they began to be more and more accommodating of what the Spanish could be doing as they returned. Now the Spanish returned, but this time much humbler. They had just had the snot kicked out of them, And so they came back and reestablished control, even military control, sometimes cruelly. But by 1696, they began to realize they had to coexist with these people and could not change them. Are those tensions occurring today? Yeah, Santa Fe is a microcosm of that. It still continues today. We have the natives who have been here for generations, and they'd rather turn the clock back to the time when others were not here. Isn't that what the Indians thought too? And then the newcomers always want to come and change New Santa Fe into something that they remember back where they came from. And that's always been the tension between the two in New Mexico, isn't it? Whether it was the Indians and the Spanish, or whether it was succeeding generations, it's still going on today, the tension, the dynamic. Anyway, this marked the birth of New Mexican culture. In the Plaza de las Tres Culturas in Mexico City, there's a monument that says, on this spot, conquered by Hernán Cortés, but defended by Cuauhtémoc, the last Aztec emperor. Neither was there the triumph of one race or the defeat of another, but the birth of a third. And that's the Mexican nation. And if you understand that, 1692, 1696 is the equivalent for New Mexico. Because the Indians realized they could not turn the clock back, and the Spanish realized they couldn't change the Indians. So they both intermarried, intermixed, to the point where we have no idea where one ends and the other begins. For example, we are very fond of our food, and we call it Spanish food. I've been to Spain. I couldn't find enchiladas anywhere. I couldn't find tacos or corn of any sort, because that food is primarily Indian in origin, isn't it? But, and so it is that the food that we have is the jewelry that we consider Indian jewelry, like this turquoise gem. The Indians did not know how to work metal before the Spanish arrived. Indian blankets were made out of cotton before, but now they were wool because the Spanish brought back the merino sheep, didn't they? So we don't know where one ends and the other begins, and that's true even racially. There was an awful lot of intermarriage. In fact, my family, my grandmother on my mother's side has Apache blood, something I don't admit to the Pueblo people too often, because they were considered the enemy as much as the Spanish were. In any case, there was a total mixing of the races, even to this point where some Pueblos have as much Spanish blood as they do Indian blood, and vice versa. Some Spanish communities, especially those who were founded by Canizos, are very much Indian. Okay, but the truth be told, the Franciscans came back much more humble. Let's talk about that for a moment. They never attained the power they had over the native populations that they had before the 1680 revolt. No one was going to be forced either by coercion or by persuasion to become a Catholic again. The Diocese of Durango began to exert its authority. I'll talk about that in just a moment. But the Franciscans began to appreciate that the Indian culture and religion and way of life was their Old Testament. That's the way it was described. The first missionaries were from Zacatecas, and they were very Eurocentric. The second came from a group called the Querétaro Franciscans, and they sought to convert and baptize the culture, not suppress it. Does that make sense? Take what's good among the Indians, baptize it, and make it Christian. That's been the genius of the Roman Catholic Church throughout the centuries. It's been this genius, taken a pagan custom, baptized it, and made it Christian. Like, for example, Christmas. Hello. There's no mention in the scriptures about when Christmas should be celebrated, the birth of the Savior. Probably from the internal criticism of this text, it probably would be around March or April because the shepherds were out in the fields. You're not out in the fields in December in Jerusalem, I can assure you. So they were out in their fields watching their flocks. So it could have been that Jesus was born in springtime, but no one knows. But what the Roman Church did is they put it smack dab in the middle of the Saturnalia, which was a pagan celebration orgy in honor of the birth of the sun, December 22nd, 23rd, 24th, and 25th, to counteract the pagan religion and to baptize that Saturnalia into Christmas. Have we seen other examples of that? Among the German peoples, they worship trees. The Benedictine monks said, oh, we'll just baptize that and make it a Christmas tree. So it's been the genius of Roman Catholicism to culturally adapt and enculturate members of other peoples and bring them into the Catholic Church that way. It's only when the Church has been constipated, so to speak, and been so Eurocentric that it hasn't done that. I'll give you a good example of that. The missionaries to China in 1730 said we should adopt Chinese customs, like for the vestiture of the vestments of the priests, the posture at Mass, the use of tallow candles and things of that nature. That was squashed by Rome. Why? Because it wasn't Catholic. No, it wasn't Catholic. It was Catholic. It wasn't Roman Catholic. Do you know what I'm saying? Okay, so what the Franciscans did here was brilliant. They took incense and they said this is just like the smudging that you do, for purification of spaces. You also would want to use the saints' days. Now, for example, here in New Mexico, I find it wonderful, wonderful that you have Indian dances in honor of the saints. Like on August the 12th, what do you have? St. Clare's feast day at Santa Clara Pueblo, and the first dances are always done in honor of the saint, St. Clare. And that's true of any Indian pueblo. In fact, to this day, the Indians say, we keep Catholicism better than the Spanish people do. You gave it to us, we keep it better. They keep the feast days, we move it all to Sunday. For convenience sake, isn't it? And they still do the dances, the traditional meals, the traditional hospitality, all that in honor of the saints and in honor of God and of the Holy Child Jesus. Now, the Diocese of Durango, which was the closest bishop, where am I rattling on here? Am I all right still?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, the body blow to the Franciscans in New Mexico occurred two ways. The diocesan bishop of Durango, the Mexican bishop, decided to start claiming more and more authority from the mission fields here in New Mexico. And he even made the audacious plot to visit New Mexico. So Bishop Crespo was visiting here in New Mexico in 1730. He was fought tooth and claw by the Franciscans all the way from El Paso, including the Superior General of the Franciscans fought him every which way and did not allow him to enter the cathedral here at the Parroquia, because he did not want to have the Bishop of Durango, the diocesan priest like me, men in black, in charge of anything. So, but eventually Rome agreed with the Bishop of Durango, and the Bishop of Durango began to exercise more authority here, and that diminished the Franciscan authority. Also, there was a great blow to Franciscans what happened during the revolt of the Mexicans from Spain. In 1810, there was an effort to try and develop independence from Spain by the Mexican people. It was granted in 1521. During that time, we had a diminution of a great number of Franciscans, about 46 down to 8 in New Mexico, because no longer was the Spanish throne supplying the missions, because they were now independent from Spain. Also, many of the Spanish Franciscans went back to Spain because they retained their citizenship in Spain. So the mission system here in New Mexico began to falter. By 1848, there were no Franciscans, no Spanish Franciscans. Now what happened? How did Christianity survive? It was not able to survive because diocesan priests from Durango were able to come. What happened with Rome, one of the shrewd moves that Rome made was to condemn Mexico for declaring independence and not allowing any more Mexican bishops to be ordained. Very smart. When you do not have a bishop, you cannot ordain priests. So the Diocese of Durango could never hardly supply more than a few priests to New Mexico. And there were a few native priests, but not many. So on the one hand, what can we say about the Spanish Franciscans' influence on New Mexico? In the final verdict, the Franciscans' effort to missionize New Mexico was not as successful as expected, for several reasons. The Franciscan missionaries never learned the language. They never learned the Indian language, whether it be Tiwa, Tewa, Toa, Keres, or Tompito. They never learned the language. They were brought in from Mexico with no prior experience of having served in New Mexico. So their idea of what the Indian peoples were from the Valley of Mexico and not up here in the Valley of Rio Grande. They never stayed in place in any one assignment more than 1 or 2 years, maybe 3. When you're never that long at any one place, you never get to know the people really well. And perhaps the greatest downfall of the Franciscans in New Mexico was they never recruited native New Mexican priests. They depended mostly on Spanish or Mexican-born recruits. They never thought New Mexicans were eligible or worthy enough to recruit for priesthood. So I'll tell you about their positive things in just a moment. I'll close it up. By the 1890s, the French archbishops who had taken over the Diocese of New Mexico by the 1853 realized that their once endless source of French clergy. You have to remember that by the time from Bishop Lamy's entrance, 1853 to 1899, he had gotten rid of most of the New Mexican clergy. By 1899, there was no New Mexican clergy. They were all European or American born. But what happened is then the French began to realize they didn't have endless sources of recruiting among the French people for clergy, and this was even dealt a bigger body blow by World War I, where the French were bled to death in their war against Germany. So there was very few recruits of French clergy that were able to come. Our last one died, I think in 79, Father Castalier. He was about 99. And so we went to visit him for the younger priests, and we said, what was the secret to your long life, Father? He said, always be a little sick. And we said, what do you mean, always be a little sick? Well enough to do your work, but too sick to volunteer for anything. That's wisdom, isn't it? That's somebody who's in for the long haul. Anyway, so the German Franciscans from Cincinnati were recruited by the French bishops, and they started coming here primarily for the impetus of a saint that lived in Santa Fe. Who was that? Mother Catherine Drexel. She was a member of the cathedral parish. She founded St. Catherine's Indian School. And she brought the Franciscans, the German Franciscans from Cincinnati, to come and take care of the Navajo missions and later the Pueblo missions. They became so successful that they ended up taking over even main city parishes like the cathedral in 1920, when the Franciscan German bishop became the bishop. His name is Dager. There's an interesting story about that. Can I tell you? Yeah. Okay, he was Dager. That's a German American. Most of the clergy were French. They just finished fighting World War I. This was not the shrewdest move on the part of the Vatican. And so the French clergy always regarded him with suspicion. Even though he was a very holy man, he was apparently not too bright. And the diocese was run by the Franciscan Superior General, basically in Cincinnati. The French wrote a petition to the Vatican asking that he be removed. This is unheard of, that the French clergy asked that he be removed. And he was removed. A letter was sent to Cincinnati, but it was intercepted there before it ever got to New Mexico. And they got the cardinal protector of the Franciscans to reverse the order. And so he continued to be bishop. He was a very holy man. But that's how much enmity there was between the French clergy and the German clergy. And the Franciscans took care of the cathedral from 1921 to when did I take over? 2000. So it's back in the hands of the men in black. In any case, the Franciscans now have a province of their own called Our Lady of Guadalupe here in New Mexico. And their dream was to be able to continue to serve the Indians in the Pueblos and the Navajo reservations. But they haven't had as much success in recruiting vocations as they would have hoped. And so they haven't had priestly vocations for a while. Most of their new recruits want to be brothers, which is admirable because Francis never himself wanted to be a priest. But that doesn't help with the parishes. I myself have taken over 2 parishes from the Franciscans, Cerrillos and the cathedral. So what can we say about the Franciscans is that they're still a work in progress. What can we say about them that they've given to us in New Mexico? It's faith as feeling, not so much as intellect. You know, it's important to feel your love for God and for others. That's a genuine Franciscan trait. It's almost as if we can't have fun loving God and serving each other. Let's close the church doors down, shall we? Because Francis loved life. In his canticles of joy and resurrection and praise to God, he loved life. And he loved his brothers. And he loved the people he served. Also from Francis and the Franciscans, we learned the acceptance of suffering and poverty. It was not a curse from God. It was just the state that we were in. And suffering sometimes led to fatalism. For example, have you seen the cross, the crucifix in the cathedral in the Conquistadora Chapel? It's a Mexican crucifix, but it could well has been New Mexican. People always ask me, how come that crucifix looks so realistic? Because he was crucified. Oftentimes modern art depicts him with a little smudge of rouge here, a little smudge of rouge here, and it looks like he's just looking from the top of the cross saying, "Hi Mom, I can see the temple from here." It looks like a picnic, but it isn't. It was one of the most brutal forms of execution ever divided by humankind. And for Hispanic Franciscans, and those of us who follow in their footsteps, acceptance of suffering was a key to salvation. For Francis, it was the Gospel of Mark. Do you know how the Gospel of Mark ends? It hardly even has a mention of the resurrection. It has 2 or 3 versions of the resurrection, and they even contradict each other. For Mark, the resurrection was not so much the victory, it was there, but the victory was in accepting the cross. Because when he died on the cross, a pagan soldier said, "Truly this was the Son of God." And so for Franciscan spirituality is in the moment of accepting the cross that we gain the victory over death. In the moment of suffering and laying down your life, you gain victory over suffering. And so that's very much a part of New Mexican spirituality. And of course, the Franciscans gave us mission architecture. Many of the missionaries that came here had some rudimentary knowledge of architecture, and so they designed what is the only indigenous form of church architecture in the United States. Did you know this? The New Mexico mission style. You know, almost every other church architecture in the United States was borrowed from Europe. just brought over hand and foot. This mission style is unique to New Mexico, with the great vigas, with the corbels, and almost always, if it was a Franciscan that built the church, go to the Conquistador Chapter, and you'll see the bond beam, right? See, that's the bond beam. If it was built by a Franciscan, there's the carved cord that the Franciscans wear around their waist for poverty, chastity, and obedience. That was the signature that this was built by a Franciscan priest. If there was a running M design, it was more obviously probably a diocesan priest that did that. Anyway, also the Santos, the depiction of art, this was very, very much a case that the Franciscans did. They would do hide paintings and carved statues, and they would use them to be instructive of the Indians. If you want to see some extraordinarily beautiful hide paintings, go to Galisteo, and you'll see some beautiful hide paintings that were used in catechesis to the Indians. Well, this was a very short jump to doing your own native art, because the studios of Mexico City and Spain were very far away. And so you develop the santos, bultos, retablos, that are the only indigenous form of church religious art in the United States. And of course, what they did leave behind is the spirit of St. Francis and the Penitente movement. And this was one of the reasons why Catholicism survived even in that period when there were so few priests here, is because of the Penitente movement. Anybody know anything about the Penitente movement? Okay, now I'm going to quote from different. Martha Weigel thinks that there was a movement, she's one of the great authors of the Penitentes, that there was a movement of the Cofradía de la Pasión that moved up from Mexico into New Mexico. I think it may have been the case, but it was grafted onto the Third Order of Francis, which was a strong trunk. Third Order of Francis created three orders: the men, the priests and brothers, the women, the poor clerics, and the lay people. And it's been known by the Visitor General in 1776, Dominguez, that every parish had a Third Order chapter, where the lay peoples lived the life of the Gospels and lived the life of Francis as much as they could. When the Franciscan priests were pulled out, it seems like this Third Order with its Cofradía de la Pasión merged into one and became the Penitentes, la Fraternidad Piadosa de Nuestro Padre Jesús Nazareno, the Brothers of the Holy Penitents. And they led the Catholic community through virtually a priestless time. They would never try to imitate the sacraments or anything of that nature, but they left behind popular devotion like processions, novenas, encuentros, passion plays, and things of that nature to keep the faith going, so that when a priest would come de vez en cuando, every once in a while, they would find a well-prepared community. So anyway, we have a lot to owe the Franciscans. Our architecture, our artwork that we consider so popular and so lovely, even the spirit of Francis, which makes our New Mexicans not conspicuous consumers, but rather willing to adapt to the earth that we're here on, and to build in a way that's more responsible for the creation that surrounds us. Let me finish with a prayer. Francis, Most High, glorious God, enlighten the darkness of my heart and give me, Lord, a correct faith, a certain hope, a perfect charity, sense and knowledge that I may carry out your holy and true commands. And this I ask in the name of Jesus. Amen. Thank you. No, next time throw money. And paper money, coins hurt. Any questions, observations, rebuttals? Yes? You know, I've always been told I should publish all my lectures, which I have a whole series of, but I'm a pastor, and I have 4 missions that I take care of. So when would I do that? Between 2 and 3 in the morning? I may not be facetious, but I've been telling the bishop he should give me some time off to write all this out. You know? But he hasn't listened to me yet. Never knows how much I suffer. But I keep telling them. Any other? Yes?
When were native peoples of New Mexico recruited to the priesthood?
It was interestingly under Archbishop Zubiria, who was the third archbishop that came up here from Durango. And it was the work of some of the local clergy like Felipe Ortiz here in Santa Fe or Antonio Jose Martinez, who also were trying to recruit natives. And there was a faint flourishing of native clergy before Lane came, but he found them a threat. And he eventually eliminated most of them. You know what I'm saying? So it was only after that, under Archbishop Byrne, that we began to recruit native clergy again. And up until we were perhaps the only diocese in Spanish-speaking America that had as many as 50% of the clergy were from New Mexico, born in New Mexican families, either Indian, Hispanic, or Anglo-American, so to speak, whatever you want to call it.
And what years were these?
Archbishop Byrne, the 40s. I mean, we're not talking about a long time ago. Yes.
I have a question. I'm perhaps one of those people that come from somewhere else and tries to bring my history here to Santa Fe. My question is, why do people say that Cabeza de Vaca was shipwrecked off the coast of Galveston when he was part of the Panfilio Navajo expedition, which began near Tampa and traveled to the Mississippi, where they killed their horses to make a boat to cross the Mississippi. That's not a shipwreck, but it's a story that the History Museum has here that you mentioned, and I think that point needs to be clarified.
Thank you for clarifying. Anything else? God bless. Thank you.